Welcome to your favorite channel for learning everything you need for financial success. Let's get started.
All right, today we're going to talk about what is, without a doubt, the single most powerful idea in modern investing. You know, it's a strategy that's so simple, Wall Street actually laughed at it when it first came out. And yet, it grew into this multi-trillion-dollar giant that completely changed the game. Let's dive into index funds. So, I'm sure you've heard the advice a million times, right? From friends, from financial gurus, everyone says, just buy a low-cost index fund. Sounds simple enough. But what are you actually buying when you do that? And how in the world did this one piece of advice become the go-to move for millions of investors? So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we're going to look at the simple promise that started this whole thing. Then, we'll get into the winning formula that made it so incredibly popular. After that, we'll peel back the curtain and look at some of the hidden risks that have popped up. And finally, we're going to ask a really big question. What happens when pretty much everyone starts investing the exact same way? So stick around, because we're going to wrap it all up with a final takeaway. Okay, let's start at the very beginning with the core idea behind it all. The promise of an index fund is just beautifully simple. It says, hey, stop trying to find that one winning needle in the haystack. I mean, what if instead you could just buy the entire haystack? So what is an index fund really? Well, it's a type of fund that's designed to do just one thing, perfectly copy a market index. So let's take the S&P 500. That's just a list of 500 of the biggest companies in America. An S&P 500 index fund doesn't have some genius manager trying to pick the best stocks out of that 500. Nope, it just buys all 500 of them in the exact same size, the exact same proportions as the index itself. The goal isn't to outsmart the market, the goal is to be the market. Now, this idea didn't just appear out of thin air. It actually started way back in the 50s and 60s as an academic theory. Then, in 1975, this legend, John Bogle of Vanguard, he launches the first ever index fund for regular people. In Wall Street, they pretty much laughed at him. But then came the 2008 financial crisis, and that was the real tipping point. Investors got burned by super complex products and crazy high fees, so they started pouring money into these simple, easy-to-understand funds. And if you fast forward to today, index funds now hold over half of all the money in US long-term funds. I mean, that's not just growth, that's a revolution. So how did this simple, almost kind of boring idea become such a powerhouse? Well, the answer is in this incredibly powerful, data-backed formula that is just really, really hard to argue with. Okay, to really get why indexing works so well, you have to see what it's up against: actively managed funds. See, an active manager's entire job is to pick stocks to try and beat the market. And that takes a huge research team, a lot of trading back and forth, and all of that costs money, which means you pay higher fees. Index funds are the complete opposite. Their job is just to match the market. That means they do very little trading, what we call low turnover, and they don't need expensive teams of stock pickers. And the result? Much, much lower fees. And when I say lower, I mean the difference in cost is just staggering. Just look at this chart. That gap is enormous. The average active fund charges more than six times what the average index fund does. Now, I know those percentages look small, but trust me, over 30 or 40 years of investing, that little gap in fees compounds into a massive, massive difference in how much money you end up with. How massive, you ask? Well, Vanguard estimates that since the year 2000, investors have saved over $500 billion in fees just by choosing index funds instead of the higher-cost active ones. That's $503 billion that stayed in investors' pockets, working for them instead of for a fund manager. You know, Nobel laureate William F. Sharpe explained this with a piece of logic that is just brutally simple. Think about it. All investors, as one giant group, are the market, right? So their average return has to be the market's return. But that's before you subtract costs. And since active investors pay way higher fees, once you subtract those costs, the average active investor is mathematically guaranteed to do worse than the average low-cost index investor. The math is just inescapable. So this winning formula really boils down to 4 key benefits. Number 1, you get instant diversification, which protects you if one single company just blows up. Number 2, those radically low costs we just talked about. 3, they're tax efficient. Because index funds don't trade very often, they create fewer capital gains, which means a smaller tax bill for you. And finally, number 4, simplicity. The whole strategy is clear, it's predictable, and it's just plain easy to understand. Okay, so index funds are simple, they're cheap, they're diversified. It sounds perfect, right? Maybe a little too perfect? So is there a catch? Well, as trillions upon trillions of dollars have flooded into these funds, some new and sometimes hidden risks have started to creep in. So let's just ask the question straight up. Are index funds the perfect investment? Well, the short answer is no. Because as they've gotten bigger and bigger, they've actually created a whole new set of challenges and risks. So while you've gotten rid of the risk of one company failing, you are completely 100% exposed to market risk. If the entire market crashes, guess what? Your index fund is going right down with it. There's also something called tracking error, where the fund's performance might lag just a tiny bit behind the index because of costs. And in a real panic, some funds can be harder to sell than you think. But maybe one of the biggest risks that has emerged is this idea of concentration. And this slide just shows the problem perfectly. Because most indexes are weighted by company size, the biggest giants have the most influence. I mean, right now, just 7 huge tech stocks make up a full third of the entire S&P 500. So that means your so-called diversified fund is actually having its performance tied to the fate of just a handful of companies. That's not as diversified as it sounds. And then there's this hidden cost, one that never ever shows up in the official fee. So check this out. When an index announces that a new stock is going to be added, professional traders know this is coming. So step 1, they rush in and they buy up that stock, which pushes the price up. Step 2, by the time the index fund is actually required to buy it, the price is already higher. And step 3, the traders sell their shares to the index fund for a quick, easy profit. The fund is literally forced to buy high, and this subtle little drag on performance costs index investors billions. So all of these risks, they lead to a bigger, almost philosophical question. As index funds completely take over the market, they're actually changing the way the market itself works. I mean, think about it. If everyone is just passively buying the index, who's actually doing the hard work of figuring out what a company is truly worth? Who's driving the car? And this is where we have to really challenge that word passive. Research from Yale Law School makes this really powerful point. Index investing isn't truly passive at all. It's actually better understood as a form of delegated management. You're still letting someone else make the big decisions. So who are you delegating to? Well, it's not the fund manager. Their job is just to follow the recipe that's handed to them. No, you're actually delegating to the committee at a company like S&P or MSCI, the people who create the index in the first place. They're the ones making the active choices about the rules, which companies get in, which ones get kicked out, how they're all weighted. So the key takeaway here, there's really no such thing as a truly passive investment. Someone, somewhere, is always making a choice. And the sheer scale of this delegation is just immense. With 51%, more than half of all long-term fund assets now sitting in index funds, the decisions made by these small, unelected index committees are now steering trillions of dollars of capital. They're influencing the entire economy. And look, this isn't just some abstract concern. Even the father of index funds himself, Jack Bogle, started to worry about this late in his life. He feared that if a few gigantic index fund providers, the big 3 like Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, ended up controlling such a huge chunk of corporate America, that much concentrated power probably wouldn't be a good thing. Okay, so we've seen the promise, we've seen the proof, and we've seen the problems that are starting to show up. So let's put it all together. What does this all really mean for you? The story of the index fund really has 3 clear chapters. It started with a simple, powerful promise, a cheap, diversified way for anyone to own a piece of the market. Then came the proof, decades of data that show, for most people, this low-cost strategy just crushes the majority of expensive stock pickers. But now we're entering a new chapter, the problem phase, where the incredible success of indexing is creating its own set of issues, hidden costs, concentration risks, and really deep questions about how our markets are supposed to work. And all of this leaves us with one final, and I think really critical question. This simple fund that was just designed to follow the market, it's now so big that it has started to lead the market. So as this trend continues, we really have to ask ourselves, when you buy an index fund today, who are you really putting in control?
Before we finish, let me give you a few tips. And remember that we upload videos every day.
Are you feeling completely crushed by debt, especially when you're trying to get by on a minimum wage? Yeah, it's a really tough place to be. But I want you to know you are not in this alone, and there is absolutely a path forward. In this explainer, we are going to build a clear, step-by-step plan to help you start taking down that debt in 2026, even when you have to watch every single penny.
You know, this quote from Experian really hits home. Let's be honest about what debt feels like. It's not just a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet. It is a huge source of stress. It's that heavy feeling you carry around all day long. So our goal today is to give you a real plan to start lifting that weight off your shoulders.
And hey, if you feel like you're the only one struggling with this, just look at this number. You are definitely not alone. The average debt for U.S. consumer in mid-2025 was over $100,000. That's a massive, widespread problem. But here's the good news. You can beat it. You just need the right plan.
So here's our roadmap for getting there. First, we're going to face the numbers. Then we'll create your battle plan. After that, we'll look at how to supercharge your payoff, find ways to fuel your fight, and finally, we'll talk about how to stay the course for the long haul.
All right, first up, facing the numbers. I know, this can be the scariest part, but it is absolutely essential. You can't fight an enemy you can't see, right? So let's get a really clear picture of exactly what we're dealing with.
So what you're going to do is create a complete debt inventory. That means grabbing every bill, logging into every account, and for each and every debt, we're talking credit cards, student loans, car payments, everything, you write down all these details. This list right here, this becomes your command center. It gives you the full lay of the land.
Okay, once you've got all your numbers laid out, it is time for Section 2, your battle plan. Now we get to choose our strategy. There are two main ways to go about this, and we're going to break them down so you can figure out which one is right for you.
And that leads us to the big question. Are you Team Snowball or Team Avalanche? Now, there's no single right answer here. The best method for you really depends on your personality. Are you someone who gets fired up by quick, small wins, or are you driven by knowing you're saving the most money possible?
Let's start with the debt snowball. Think of this one as the psychological boost method. It's all about building momentum. You actually ignore the interest rates for a minute and throw all your extra cash at your smallest debt first.
The process here is simple, but trust me, it's powerful. You list your debts from smallest to largest. Then you pay just the minimum on everything except for that smallest one. You attack that one with every extra dollar you have. Once it's gone, poof, you get this amazing psychological win. Then you take all the money you were paying on that debt and roll it over to the next smallest one. It creates this snowball of repayment that just gets bigger and bigger.
Now the other option is the debt avalanche. This is the method for all my number crunchers out there. Instead of focusing on the balance, you attack the debt with the highest interest rate first. Mathematically speaking, this is the fastest way out of debt, and it saves you the most money on interest in the long run.
The steps are pretty similar. You list your debts by interest rate, from the highest down to the lowest. You pay the minimums on all but that top one, and you throw every extra cent at that high-interest monster. Once it's knocked out, you roll that payment over to the next one on the list, creating an unstoppable avalanche of payments.
So which one is for you? Well, if you need those quick wins to keep your spirits up, go with the snowball. It works. If you're all about logic and saving the absolute most money on interest, the avalanche is your best friend. Seriously, there is no wrong answer here. The best plan is the one you will actually stick with. All right, so you picked your strategy. Awesome. Now let's move on to Section 3 and talk about how to supercharge your payoff. This is all about finding the fuel, the extra cash, to make your plan work even faster.
A really popular tool is the 50-30-20 rule. The basic idea is 50% of your take-home pay goes to needs, 30% to wants, and 20% to savings and paying off debt. Now, I know what you might be thinking. On a minimum wage, those numbers can feel impossible. But hang with me. The principle is what matters. Just knowing where your money is going is the first step to finding extra cash to throw at your debt.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to shrink that want slice as much as we possibly can, so we can grow that debt repayment slice. When your income is tight, every single dollar makes a difference, and that usually means making some smart, temporary sacrifices. So where can you find this extra cash? It usually starts in that wants category. Could you switch to free workout videos online instead of paying for a gym? Maybe pause 1 or 2 streaming services for a few months. You could even try a no-spend weekend just to see where your money goes on autopilot. Every dollar you can save and redirect is a... Okay, now let's dive into Section 4, fueling your fight. Cutting back is one half of the strategy, but we can also get proactive and find more resources to really speed things up. What if I told you there's one single move you can make that costs you absolutely nothing, but could save you hundreds, maybe even thousands of dollars? This is a total game changer, especially if you have high-interest credit card debt.
You just have to ask for a lower interest rate. It's really that simple.
So many people never even think to try this, but lenders would often rather lower your rate than risk you not paying at all. It's a negotiation, and you have way more power than you think.
And here's your script for that call. Start with the credit card you've been with the longest. Be polite, be calm, explain you're working really hard to pay down your debt, and be sure to mention your history of on-time payments. If they say no to a permanent reduction, ask for a temporary one. And don't give up if you hear no once. Call back in a few months. Persistence really pays off.
Okay, so besides lowering your rates, the other side of this coin is boosting your income. You know, even an extra $50 a month can make a huge dent. Do you have a skill you could use for some freelance work? Can you sell some stuff you don't use anymore? A few hours of dog walking or rideshare driving on the weekend can add some serious punch to your repayment plan.
And that brings us to our final and maybe the most important section, staying the course. Because let's be real, getting out of debt is a marathon, not a sprint. Your motivation is the fuel that's going to get you all the way to the finish line.
So, how do you stay fired up? Well, don't just stare at the giant final number. Break it down into mini goals. Celebrate paying off your first $200. When you hit a milestone, reward yourself with something that's free but that you love, like an afternoon at the park. Find a friend you trust to be your accountability partner. And remember, there are nonprofit credit counselors out there if you need some professional support.
So, we've gone through the entire roadmap. We've faced the numbers, chosen a strategy, found ways to supercharge it, and talked about how to stay motivated. You now have a complete plan to take back control of your finances in 2026. So the only question left is the most important one of all. What's your first move?
We upload videos every day. Subscribe and become part of the family. See you tomorrow.